In the summer of 1941, the German war machine was moving east with terrifying speed and precision. Army Group North was tearing through the Baltic states, leaving shattered Soviet units in its wake. The Red Army was collapsing on almost every front, outmaneuvered, outgunned, and overwhelmed by the ferocity of Operation Barbarossa. And yet, in the middle of all that catastrophic collapse, something happened near a small Lithuanian town called Raseiniai that would quietly plant a seed in the mind of one of history's most ruthless rulers. The archive is open. Subscribe to Cold War Black Files and uncover what history tried to hide. A single Soviet KV-2 tank, separated from its unit and running low on ammunition, had ground an entire German Kampfgruppe to a halt for more than a day. One tank, one crew. Now one machine so heavily armoured that German anti-tank rounds bounced off it like pebbles. The Germans tried everything: artillery, anti-tank guns, even an 88mm flak cannon dragged into position under fire. Again and again the shells struck the hull and skidded away. The crew inside kept fighting. It was only through extraordinary effort, encirclement, and eventually a lucky shot into the running gear that the Germans managed to stop it. When the report reached Moscow and found its way to Stalin, his reaction was not grief over the hundreds of thousands of men already lost. It was not frustration over the disorganized retreat or the catastrophic failures of Soviet command. It was something closer to excitement. Here, in the wreckage of an early disaster, was proof of a concept he had long believed in: that raw, as overwhelming physical power could reshape the battlefield. If one tank could stop a Kampfgruppe for a day, what could a machine 10 times its size do? Stalin called his designers in. The meeting was tense in the way all meetings with Stalin were tense. Men sat carefully, spoke carefully, breathed carefully. He laid the idea before them with the kind of blunt simplicity that left no room for objection. He wanted a land battleship. Not a heavy tank in the conventional sense, something categorically different. A machine that combined the firepower of artillery, the armour of a fortress, and the mobility of a tracked vehicle. He wanted something that could advance through an entire defensive line while shrugging off everything the Germans could throw at it. He wanted it based on the KV-2 chassis, because the KV-2 had proven itself in the most direct way possible: by refusing to die. The designers went to work knowing that failure was not a professional setback. It was a death sentence. The pressure in Soviet design bureaus during the war was unlike anything experienced in any other country's military-industrial complex. Engineers who produced results were heroes. Engineers who failed or delivered excuses were enemies of the state. The men who took on this project understood exactly what they were agreeing to. The concept they began developing pushed the boundaries of Soviet industrial capacity in ways that even the most ambitious pre-war thinkers had not seriously contemplated. And the KV-2 itself was already a monster by any standard. A box-shaped turret sitting atop a hull that had been designed for a much smaller gun, its massive 152mm howitzer capable of demolishing fortifications, its armour thick enough to deflect most German weapons at standard combat ranges. But it was also slow, mechanically unreliable, difficult to drive, and prone to throwing its tracks on rough terrain. Its transmission was a nightmare. Its crew was often exhausted simply from the physical demands of operating it. A land battleship built on this foundation would have to solve all of those problems and then multiply the entire concept by an order of magnitude. The weight projections alone were staggering. Early estimates suggested a machine that would tip the scales somewhere between 100 and 200 metric tons, depending on the armour configuration and armament chosen. For comparison, the KV-2 itself weighed around 52 tons and was already considered dangerously heavy for most Soviet bridges and many roads. A machine twice or 4 times that weight would require entirely new thinking about mobility, terrain management, and logistics. The design team began sketching layouts that drew on everything from pre-war Soviet supertank experiments to German and British concepts that had trickled into Soviet intelligence files. Multi-turret configurations were discussed, Some proposals involved a main battery of large-caliber guns, supplemented by secondary turrets handling anti-infantry and anti-aircraft roles, essentially mirroring the philosophy of a naval battleship translated onto tracks. Now, the idea was that such a machine would be its own combined arms platform, capable of engaging enemy tanks, artillery, infantry, and aircraft without relying on support from other units. Power was the central problem. Existing Soviet tank engines, even in their most powerful configurations, were nowhere near capable of moving a machine of this proposed size at any useful speed. Engineers began drawing up specifications for either multiple engines working in tandem or an entirely new power plant designed specifically for this application. The complexity of synchronizing multiple engines through a single drivetrain while maintaining driver control was a challenge that had defeated earlier multi-turret Soviet designs, and everyone in the room knew it. The T-35, the massive 5-turreted tank that had been the pride of Soviet pre-war parades, had turned into a mechanical catastrophe in 1941. Most of them lost not to enemy fire, but to breakdowns and abandoned by their own crews. Stalin was not particularly interested in these complications. He had a habit of demanding the impossible and then being genuinely surprised when engineers explained why physics and metallurgy imposed limits. When briefed on early progress, he pushed for heavier armor, larger guns, and faster production timelines simultaneously, apparently not registering that each of these demands made the others harder to meet. The designers learned to nod and then quietly work backward from what was actually achievable, while making their progress reports sound optimistic. The armor requirements alone consumed weeks of debate. To be genuinely impervious to German 88mm fire, the weapon that had eventually stopped the KV-2 at Raseiniai, the vehicle would need plate thicknesses that went far beyond anything currently being rolled at Soviet steel mills. The mills themselves were in chaos, many of them in the process of being dismantled and shipped east ahead of the German advance, their workers riding freight cars into Siberia alongside the machines they had spent years learning to operate. Getting quality armor plate of the required thickness and composition was not simply an engineering problem. It was a logistical and industrial challenge of the first order. Meanwhile, the war continued to go badly. Army Group Center was pushing toward Moscow. Leningrad was being encircled, or hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were being captured in massive encirclement battles that the German command was almost disbelieving in their scale. The land battleship project existed in a strange parallel to all of this, a long-term ambition being pursued during a crisis that demanded everything be focused on immediate survival. Some of the engineers quietly believed the project was strategically incoherent, a vanity born from a single remarkable incident being overinterpreted by a leader who wanted a symbol as much as a weapon. The KV-2 at Raseiniai had not won the battle. It had delayed one column for one day. The Germans had simply gone around it, continued their advance, and within weeks those same roads were deep behind enemy lines. A land battleship, however impressive, could not be everywhere. It could not plug every gap. It could not substitute for the trained divisions, coherent command structures, and reliable communications that the Soviet military was desperately lacking. But these were not thoughts anyone expressed out loud. The project moved forward. Prototype components were tested, subsystems evaluated, and competing designs argued over, in sessions that stretched through nights while German bombs fell on cities hundreds of kilometers away. The transmission problem resisted solution after solution. Track designs that could theoretically handle the projected weight were found to be impossible to manufacture in the quantities needed with the available tooling. The gun calibers discussed for the main armament raised questions about ammunition storage and handling inside the vehicle that nobody could fully answer without actually building a full-scale mock-up, which itself required resources that the state could not easily spare. By late 1941, the character of the project had begun to shift. The emergency of the German advance had forced brutal prioritizations across the entire Soviet defense industry. The T-34 was being produced in massive numbers because it had shown it could be built quickly, maintained in the field, and used effectively by crews who had received relatively minimal training. The KV-1, A simpler and more reliable heavy tank than the KV-2 was being refined and pushed through factories. These were the weapons that were actually going to stop the Germans. And the land battleship was not going to be ready in months. It might not be ready in years. And years were not something the Soviet Union was confident it had. Stalin's attention, never entirely fixed on any single project, began to move. The land battleship remained technically alive in the bureaucratic sense. No one was going to be the person who formally cancelled something Stalin had personally ordered. But resources dried up. Design meetings became less frequent, and the engineers were quietly redirected toward more immediately pressing work. The concept retreated into the background, a monument to a moment of excitement in the middle of catastrophe. What the project left behind was more than a stack of unbuilt blueprints. It revealed something about the nature of Soviet military thinking in that desperate period. The constant tension between the desire for decisive, overwhelming technological solutions and the practical reality of an industrial base under impossible stress. It revealed Stalin's instinct to look at a single data point and extrapolate a grand strategic solution, a habit that sometimes produced insight and sometimes produced projects that consumed resources without producing results. And it revealed the extraordinary pressure that Soviet engineers and designers worked under, producing genuine innovations in some areas while being unable to deliver on demands that simply exceeded what the laws of engineering and physics would permit. The KV-2 that held the road at Raseiniai had been a remarkable machine operated by a remarkable crew in a specific set of circumstances that would never be perfectly replicated. The land battleship it inspired would never exist. But for a few months in the worst year of the worst war in history, men in Moscow bent over drafting tables and tried to build it anyway, because they had no choice, and because somewhere in the idea of an unstoppable machine, there was a comfort that raw reality was unwilling to provide. Declassified, but not forgotten. Subscribe for the next revelation.